Abstract: the workplace in 2025 experienced a pervasive erosion of trust across multiple organizational touchpoints, transforming skepticism into the default employee mindset. Drawing on longitudinal data from LiveCareer's multi-study trust deficit report and established academic research on organizational trust. This analysis examines how credibility weakens systematically throughout the employee lifecycle, from deceptive hiring practices and politicized performance reviews to gossip-laden peer dynamics and fractured manager relationships. Findings reveal that 45% of HR professionals admit posting ghost jobs. 79% of employees would avoid 360-degree reviews if possible. 58% witness weekly workplace gossip, and 40% have resigned due to managerial distrust. These patterns signal not isolated frustrations but a fundamental legitimacy crisis in employment relationships. Organizations seeking to restore confidence must move beyond symbolic gestures toward structural transparency, procedural fairness, and leadership accountability that rebuilds trust through consistent action rather than aspirational rhetoric. Trust has long served as the invisible architecture of effective organizations, the foundation enabling collaboration, risk-taking, and sustained performance. Meyer et al. 1995. Yet evidence from 2025 suggests this foundation has become dangerously unstable. From the initial job search through daily workplace interactions, employees increasingly question the authenticity of organizational commitments, the fairness of evaluation systems, and the reliability of those in positions of authority. This erosion matters profoundly for practical reasons. Research consistently demonstrates that trust predicts critical organizational outcomes including job performance, organizational citizenship behaviors, and retention. Colquitt et al. 2007. Dirks and Ferrin, 2002. Conversely, when trust deteriorates, the consequences cascade through engagement, innovation, customer service, and financial performance. The relationship between supervisor trust and employee outcomes proves particularly consequential, often exceeding the effects of trust in senior leadership or the organization as entity. Dirks and Ferrin, 2002. The 2025 workplace trust crisis emerged not from a single catastrophic event but through accumulated credibility failures across hiring transparency, performance fairness, peer relationships, and leadership behavior. LiveCareer's comprehensive end-of-year analysis, synthesizing multiple studies conducted throughout the year, reveals a workforce no longer willing to extend default confidence to employers, systems, or colleagues. Understanding why trust collapsed, and how organizations can systematically rebuild it, represents one of the most consequential challenges facing practitioners as they enter 2026. The contemporary trust landscape defining organizational trust in the modern employment context. Organizational trust comprises employees' willingness to be vulnerable to organizational actions based on expectations that the employer will perform actions beneficial to them, regardless of monitoring ability. Meyer et al. 1995. This multidimensional construct encompasses trust in multiple reference, the organization as entity, direct managers, senior leadership, peers, and HR systems. Fulmer and Gelfand, 2012. Contemporary trust research identifies three essential components that parallel employee expectations revealed in the 2025 data. Meyer and colleagues, 1995. Influential integrative model specifies these dimensions as ability, the trustee's competence and skills in domains relevant to the truster, the capacity to actually fulfill commitments made, benevolence, the extent to which the trustee is believed to want to do good for the truster. Aside from egocentric motives, genuine care for employee welfare, integrity, the truster's perception that the trustee adheres to acceptable principles, including consistency between words and actions when any component falters, hiring teams posting non-existent roles, integrity failure, managers delivering biased feedback, ability and integrity failure. Or organizations ignoring employee welfare during decisions, benevolence failure, trust deteriorates rapidly and recovers slowly. This asymmetry occurs because negative information carries disproportionate weight in trust judgments compared to positive information. Slovic. 1993. The employment relationship itself has fundamentally shifted from transactional exchange toward relational psychological contract, where trust mediates the gap between formal agreements and unwritten expectations. Rousseau. 1995. Psychological contracts encompass employees' beliefs about mutual obligations between themselves and employers, beliefs shaped by explicit promises, implicit signals, and organizational actions. Violations of this psychological contract, perceived breaches between promised and delivered experiences, trigger particularly severe trust damage, often resulting in withdrawal behaviors including reduced engagement, lowered citizenship behaviors, and turnover. Robinson and Rousseau. 1994. Research demonstrates that psychological contract violations predict decreased job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and in-role performance, while increasing turnover intentions. Zhao et al. 2007. Prevalence, drivers, and distribution of the 2025 Trust Deficit. LiveCareer's 2025 Trust Deficit Report documents trust erosion across 4 critical organizational domains, each revealing distinct failure patterns. Hiring credibility crisis. The Ghost Jobs study of over 900 HR professionals exposed systematic deception at the employment relationship's entry point. Approximately 45% of HR professionals acknowledged regularly posting ghost jobs, advertised positions with no genuine hiring intent. This practice, often rationalized as talent pipeline building or organizational signaling, creates profound candidate disillusionment when communications cease without explanation. The pattern reflects what organizational justice scholars term informational justice, one component of procedural justice concerning the adequacy of explanations provided regarding procedures or outcomes. Colquitt et al. 2001. Informational justice proves particularly critical during selection processes where applicants lack insider knowledge and depend on organizational communications to interpret their status and treatment. Gilliland. 1993. When hiring communications fail to provide honest, timely information, initial trust formation becomes compromised before employment even begins. Performance system delegitimization. The 360-degree reviews report revealed widespread employee rejection of multi-rater feedback processes. A striking 79% of employees would opt out of 360-degree reviews given choice, while 74% reported receiving unfair, biased, or inaccurate feedback. Nearly half, 48%, perceived the process as amplifying office politics, and 79% suspected colleagues weaponized feedback to settle personal grievances. These findings align with organizational justice research demonstrating that fair procedures can maintain trust and acceptance even when outcomes disappoint, but only when processes demonstrate consistency. Bias suppression. Accurate information use, correctability, representativeness, and ethical standards. Leventhal, 1980. Multi-source feedback systems, when implemented without adequate rater training, accountability mechanisms, or separation between developmental and evaluative purposes, can violate multiple procedural justice principles simultaneously, introducing inconsistent standards across raters, failing to suppress bias and lacking effective correctability when inaccurate feedback emerges. Peer relationship deterioration. The workplace gossip study documented how informal communication patterns erode lateral trust. More than 58% of employees witnessed workplace gossip weekly, with 31% encountering it daily. Nearly half, 47%, identified gossip as creating tension and distrust, while 43% reported being gossip subjects themselves. Most alarmingly, nearly half of employees stated they trust no one at work with confidential information, a devastating indictment of psychological safety. Gossip often emerges as an informal mechanism for obtaining information, enforcing norms, and navigating social structures when formal communication proves inadequate. Grosser et al. 2012. However, when gossip becomes the primary information channel, particularly negative gossip focused on character and competence rather than behavior, it systematically undermines the interpersonal trust necessary for effective collaboration. The finding that nearly half of employees trust no colleagues with confidential information suggests a fundamental collapse of the psychological safety that enables learning, innovation, and candid problem-solving. Edmondson, 1999. Leadership credibility collapse. The Generational Workplace Trust Report revealed severe manager-employee trust fractures. Approximately 40% of workers had resigned from positions due to managerial distrust, while 53% reported feeling misled or lied to by a manager. A quarter of employees did not fully trust their manager to act in their best interests. These patterns prove particularly consequential because meta-analytic research demonstrates that trust in supervisor predicts employee job performance, organizational citizenship behaviors, job satisfaction, organizational commitment, and turnover intentions more strongly than trust in organizational leadership or the organization as entity. Dirks and Ferrin. 2002. Supervisor trust operates through multiple mechanisms, reducing transaction costs and monitoring needs, enabling effective delegation, facilitating information exchange, and influencing how employees interpret organizational actions and policies. When manager trustworthiness falters, through broken promises, inconsistent treatment, or perceived self-interest, the proximal relationship that most directly shapes daily work experience deteriorates, often triggering exit regardless of broader organizational conditions. The distribution of trust deficits appears relatively uniform across organizational levels and employment stages, suggesting systemic rather than localized failures. The 2025 pattern indicates that trust erosion has become normalized rather than exceptional, a shift from isolated incidents to embedded cultural expectation of skepticism. Organizational and individual consequences of workplace trust erosion. Organizational performance impacts. Trust deterioration exacts measurable costs across multiple organizational performance dimensions. Meta-analytic research demonstrates that workplace trust strongly predicts job performance. Rho equals 30. Organizational citizenship behaviors. Rho equals 42. And counterproductive work behaviors negatively. Rho equals dash 32, while also correlating significantly with job satisfaction. Rho equals 51. And organizational commitment. Rho equals 49. Colquitt et al. 2007. The 2025 trust crisis threatens to undermine these critical outcomes systematically. Turnover and retention costs. The finding that 40% of employees have resigned due to managerial distrust aligns with meta-analytic evidence showing trust in supervisor as among the strongest predictors of turnover intentions and actual turnover behavior. Dirks and Ferrin. 2002. While exact replacement cost estimates vary by role and industry, research consistently demonstrates substantial expenses associated with voluntary turnover, including separation costs, recruitment and selection expenses, training investments, and productivity losses during vacancy and new employee learning periods. Conservative estimates suggest replacing employees costs between 50 to 150% of annual salary for most positions, with costs escalating for specialized roles requiring extensive training or institutional knowledge. For organizations experiencing even moderate trust-driven turnover increases, for instance, moving from 10% to 15% annual voluntary turnover in a 1,000 person workforce with $60,000 median salary, the incremental replacement costs could easily exceed 4 to 5 million annually. Beyond direct replacement expenses, trust-driven turnover concentrates disproportionately among high performers who possess greater mobility and alternatives, Des and Shaw. 2001, amplifying the performance impact through selective retention of less capable employees. Productivity and engagement deterioration. Trust enables organizational effectiveness through multiple pathways that low-trust environments systematically obstruct. When employees trust leaders and colleagues, they require less monitoring, share information more freely, cooperate more extensively on complex tasks, and invest discretionary effort beyond minimum requirements, Dirks and Ferrin. 2002. Trust also shapes how employees interpret organizational communications and changes, with high-trust employees giving benefit of doubt to ambiguous actions while low-trust employees assume negative intent. When 79% of employees actively want to avoid performance feedback systems and half trust no colleagues with confidential information, the collaborative foundation required for complex work fundamentally erodes. Employees in low-trust environments invest substantial cognitive and emotional resources in self-protection, political navigation, and information verification, resources diverted from productive work. The collaborative behaviors that drive innovation and problem-solving diminish as employees retreat to narrow role definitions and avoid the interpersonal risk-taking that complex coordination requires. Innovation and adaptive capacity suppression. Psychological safety. Employees' shared belief they can take interpersonal risks, including admitting mistakes, asking questions, seeking feedback, and proposing novel ideas without punishment or embarrassment, requires foundational trust. Edmondson. 1999. Research demonstrates that psychological safety predicts learning behavior, error reporting, and innovation in teams and organizations. When nearly half of employees report unfair feedback processes and witness daily gossip, the willingness to engage in the experimental thinking, open debate, and constructive challenge that drives innovation collapses. Organizations facing dynamic competitive environments require adaptive capacity to sense emerging threats and opportunities, experiment with responses, and learn from successes and failures. Low-trust cultures suppress this adaptability by punishing the very behaviors: candid assessment, acknowledged uncertainty, failed experiments, that enable organizational learning. Employees retreat to proven approaches and avoid challenging status quo, even when environmental changes render existing practices obsolete. Customer and stakeholder outcomes. Employee trust influences customer and stakeholder experiences through multiple pathways. Frontline employees with discretionary authority to solve customer problems and genuine investment in organizational success deliver superior service experiences compared to disengaged employees following scripts defensively. Trust in management predicts employees' willingness to advocate for the organization to external stakeholders, recommend it as employer or service provider, and represent it authentically rather than cynically. As frontline employees disengage due to trust erosion, evidenced by the 53% who feel misled by managers, customer interactions become transactional rather than relational. Service quality suffers as employees minimize effort, avoid problem-solving discretion that creates vulnerability, and express cynicism that customers detect. The organizational citizenship behaviors that create exceptional stakeholder experiences, going beyond role requirements, helping colleagues, maintaining positive attitudes, prove particularly sensitive to trust climate. Colquitt et al. 2007. Individual well-being and stakeholder impacts beyond organizational metrics. Trust deterioration imposes severe costs on individual employee well-being and broader stakeholder groups. Employee mental health and stress. Working in low-trust environments generates chronic stress through multiple mechanisms. Uncertainty about others' intentions and organizational stability activates threat response systems. Maintaining elevated vigilance that depletes psychological resources, Hopeful. 1989. The emotional labor required to navigate political dynamics. Manage impressions carefully, and suppress authentic reactions creates exhaustion and burnout risk. Procedural injustice, unfair processes and inadequate explanations, predicts stress-related health complaints including cardiovascular symptoms. Sleep disturbances and psychological strain, Ilovania et al. 2002. The finding that 48% perceive performance reviews as amplifying office politics signals that employees must constantly manage relationship and impression dynamics rather than focusing on substantive work. This chronic political navigation imposes cognitive load and emotional exhaustion that extends beyond work hours. Meta-analytic evidence links organizational injustice to increased burnout across all three dimensions: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment, Molina et al. 2005. Career development and economic mobility, when 74% of employees receive feedback they perceive as unfair or biased, and 79% suspect political motivations in peer assessments. Legitimate skill development signals become obscured by noise. Employees in low-trust environments demonstrate reduced willingness to seek developmental feedback. Limiting growth opportunities, Edmondson, 1999. The psychological safety necessary for acknowledging weaknesses. Experimenting with new approaches and requesting support diminishes when trust erodes. Constraining learning and capability building. The 40% who ultimately resign due to managerial distrust may experience career setbacks through interrupted tenure, lost institutional knowledge value, and potentially reactive job transitions that compromise long-term positioning. Trust violations trigger strong emotional reactions including anger and betrayal that can impair decision-making quality during job searches, leading to suboptimal matches or desperate choices that perpetuate career dissatisfaction. Work-life boundary erosion. Trust deterioration rarely remains contained within organizational boundaries. Employees experiencing workplace trust violations report increased work-family conflict as stress and rumination spill into personal time. Hopeful. 1989. The constant vigilance required when trusting no colleagues with confidential information, as reported by nearly half of 2025 survey respondents, represents emotional labor that depletes resources needed for non-work relationships and recovery. Conservation of resources theory suggests that individuals possess limited pools of psychological resources including attention, emotional regulation capacity, and energy. Hopeful. 1989. When workplace distrust drains these resources through hypervigilance and political navigation, less remains available for family relationships, personal development, community engagement, or restoration through leisure. This spillover can create negative cycles where work stress undermines personal relationships, reducing the social support that might buffer workplace difficulties. Broader societal labor market impacts. At scale, widespread organizational trust erosion affects labor market efficiency and societal well-being. The ghost jobs phenomenon, with 45% of HR professionals admitting to deceptive posting practices, wastes collective millions of hours in futile application efforts while distorting labor market signals. Job seekers cannot distinguish genuine opportunities from placeholders, misallocating search effort and potentially making suboptimal career decisions based on false availability information. When talented individuals disengage from formal employment due to accumulated trust violations, organizations lose diverse perspectives while individuals lose economic security and social connection that employment traditionally provides. The psychological contract violations documented in 2025 may contribute to broader cultural skepticism toward institutions, reducing social capital and civic engagement beyond workplace contexts. Putnam. 2000. Evidence-based organizational responses. Organizations seeking to rebuild trust in 2026 cannot rely on symbolic gestures or aspirational statements. Research consistently demonstrates that trust develops through demonstrated competence, consistent benevolence, and reliable integrity over time. Meyer et al. 1995. The following evidence-based interventions address the specific trust fractures revealed in the 2025 data. Transparent hiring. Communication grounded in informational justice. The ghost jobs crisis demands fundamental reforms to recruiting communication practices. Research on organizational justice demonstrates that informational justice, providing truthful, adequate, timely explanations for decisions and processes, significantly predicts applicant trust and organizational attractiveness, particularly during selection where candidates lack insider information. Gilliland. 1993. Informational justice encompasses both content, explanation adequacy, and delivery, interpersonal treatment respect. Effective approaches include explicit, realistic hiring timeline communication, specify genuine timeframes for application review, interview scheduling, and decision communication in job postings based on historical data rather than aspirational goals. Send automated status updates at promised intervals even when decisions remain pending. Acknowledge delays transparently when they occur. Honest position status classification. Clearly distinguish between immediate openings requiring urgent filling, pipeline building for anticipated future needs, internal first opportunities with external backup options, and exploratory postings testing market interest. Remove or clearly update postings within defined timeframes when status changes. Universal candidate communication as baseline expectation. Implement systematic notification to all applicants who invest time in applications, including those not advancing, with brief explanation. Categories, qualifications gap, stronger candidate pool, role evolution, hiring freeze, rather than silence that violates informational justice principles. Post-process candidate experience feedback. Solicit structured feedback from candidates about communication adequacy, timeline adherence, and respectful treatment. Analyze patterns by recruiter, department, and process stage. Share aggregate results demonstrating accountability. Recruiter performance metrics expansion. Evaluate recruiting staff not only on efficiency metrics like time to fill and cost per hire but on candidate experience quality indicators and communication consistency measures. A large hospitality organization implemented comprehensive applicant communication reforms after identifying significant candidate experience gaps in their high-volume recruiting operations. The company established guaranteed response timeframes for all candidates advancing to initial phone screens. Created template status update communications delivered automatically at 2-week intervals regardless of decision status, and required recruiters to provide specific non-advancement reasons from standardized, respectful categories rather than generic rejections. Within 1 year, candidate satisfaction scores increased substantially. Employer review ratings improved significantly, and quality of hire metrics strengthened as improved employer brand attracted stronger applicant pools despite competitive labor markets. Procedural justice in performance evaluation systems. The widespread rejection of 360-degree feedback processes, with 79% preferring to opt out, signals fundamental legitimacy problems requiring procedural reform rather than process abandonment. Organizational justice research demonstrates that fair procedures can maintain trust and outcome acceptance even when results disappoint. Provided processes demonstrate 6 key characteristics. Leventhal. 1980. Consistency across people and time. Bias suppression through neutral decision-makers. Accuracy of information used. Correctability through appeal mechanisms. Representativeness of stakeholder concerns. Ethical standards. Adherence. Multi-source feedback systems violate these principles when implemented without adequate safeguards. Raters apply inconsistent standards. Personal biases influence ratings. Feedback lacks behavioral specificity. No correction processes exist for inaccurate input. Political dynamics override performance focus, and confidentiality enables unethical score manipulation. Effective approaches include rater accountability through attribution and justification requirements. Require raters to provide specific behavioral examples supporting ratings rather than numerical scores alone. Share feedback attribution for evaluative purposes, reserving anonymity only for purely developmental multi-source input. To enable dialogue and reduce political gaming calibration sessions with evidence-based review, conduct structured leadership meetings where managers present rating rationales with supporting behavioral evidence. Collectively challenge unsupported assessments and ensure consistent standards across groups. Document calibration discussions demonstrating procedural rigor, appeal and correction mechanisms with substantive review. Establish clear processes for employees to contest inaccurate feedback with counter-evidence. Require manager response addressing specific concerns. Mandate rating revision when legitimate challenges demonstrate factual inaccuracy. Separation of developmental and evaluative purposes. Reserve true 360-degree processes with peer and subordinate input for developmental purposes without compensation or promotion linkage. Use manager assessment with calibration oversight for evaluative decisions affecting reward. Systematic bias audits and pattern analysis. Analyze performance rating distributions by demographic characteristics. Organizational tenure, team assignments, and rater-AT relationships. Investigate and address systematic disparities suggesting bias rather than legitimate performance variance. Publicly share audit results demonstrating commitment to fairness. A major technology company eliminated traditional annual performance reviews featuring complex multi-rater input in favor of simplified, ongoing feedback conversations between managers and employees. Emphasizing real-time coaching, goal clarity, and development rather than retrospective numerical ratings with peer input. The company implemented quarterly calibration discussions where managers collectively review team member contributions with supporting evidence. Reducing recency bias and political influence while maintaining consistency. Following implementation, voluntary turnover declined substantially, particularly among high performers who previously felt ratings inadequately recognized contributions. While employee survey data showed significant increases in perceived feedback fairness and manager trust. Manager capability building for trustworthy leadership with 53% of employees reporting feeling misled by managers and 40% having resigned due to managerial distrust. Leadership development represents critical intervention territory. Meta-analytic research demonstrates that supervisor trustworthiness, comprising ability, benevolence and integrity, strongly predicts employee job performance. Organizational citizenship behaviors, job satisfaction, commitment and retention, with effects often exceeding organizational trust. Dirks and Ferrin. 2002. Effective approaches include promise-making discipline and commitment-keeping accountability. Train managers to make fewer but more reliable commitments by carefully considering capacity and dependencies before promising outcomes. Practice explicit communication about what they can and cannot control or deliver. Establish personal tracking systems for commitments made. Implement follow-through verification and explanation when circumstances prevent fulfillment. Transparent decision communication frameworks. Provide structured templates for explaining decisions affecting employees. Project assignments. Resource allocations, reorganizations, policy changes that address 5 elements: context and business rationale. Criteria and trade-offs considered, alternatives evaluated. Decision limitations or constraints and implementation approach. Require explanation delivery before implementation when feasible. Integrity demonstrating consistency between words and actions. Coach managers to explicitly connect stated values to daily decisions and behaviors. Identify and address gaps between espoused priorities and actual time allocation or resource investment. Practice acknowledging when competing pressures create value conflicts requiring transparent trade-off decisions. Benevolence signaling through employee welfare consideration. Train managers to explicitly consider and articulate employee well-being implications when making decisions. Demonstrate genuine care through check-ins focused on employee concerns rather than task updates. Provide authentic support during difficult personal circumstances. Resist sacrificing employee interests for short-term results. Competence development in core management domains. Build manager capability in essential areas including goal setting, delegation, coaching, difficult conversations, and conflict resolution through structured skill-building programs with practice opportunities and feedback. Ensure managers possess genuine ability to fulfill leadership responsibilities. A global professional services firm invested significantly in manager effectiveness when employee survey data revealed concerning trust gaps. Implementing mandatory quarterly development workshops focused on transparent communication, consistent follow-through, and employee welfare consideration. The company also introduced structured skip-level conversations where senior leaders meet directly with individual contributors to understand manager behaviors affecting trust. Sharing aggregate themes confidentially with managers for development. Managers receive specific behavioral feedback on trustworthiness dimensions with coaching support. Following implementation, the percentage of employees agreeing with trust-related survey items increased substantially, while team performance metrics improved as collaboration and information sharing strengthened. Structured communication infrastructure that prevents information vacuums. The workplace gossip epidemic, with 58% witnessing it weekly and nearly half trusting no one with confidential information, stems largely from inadequate formal communication, creating vacuums that informal channels fill with speculation. Grosser et al. 2012. Research demonstrates that information adequacy, timeliness, accuracy, and explanation completeness, core elements of informational justice, directly predict organizational trust. Colquitt et al. 2001. Effective approaches include predictable organizational communication cadence, establish regular all-employee updates, monthly or quarterly depending on organizational size and change pace, addressing strategy, performance, challenges and changes. Maintain schedule consistency even when news seems unremarkable to build reliability and reduce uncertainty. Proactive change communication that precedes rumor. Share pending changes and evolving situations as early as feasible rather than waiting for final decisions. Reducing surprise and speculation. Explicitly describe what remains uncertain and when additional information will be available. Acknowledge anxiety or concerns directly. Anonymous question mechanisms with public substantive response. Create channels for employees to submit questions confidentially about organizational issues, decisions, or concerns. Address substantive themes publicly in leadership forums or written communications. Demonstrating willingness to engage difficult topics. Explain when certain information cannot be shared and why. Manager communication support and coordination. Equip frontline leaders with advance notice, talking points, FAQs, and escalation paths for major announcements. Ensuring message consistency and reducing "my manager doesn't know anything" perceptions that undermine credibility. Provide dedicated channels for managers to raise concerns or questions before broader communication. Feedback loop closure. Demonstrating input impact when soliciting employee feedback through surveys or forums. Systematically communicate what was heard, what will change as result, what cannot change and why, and how decisions were made. Demonstrate that providing input influences organizational action rather than disappearing into void. An outdoor retail company addresses gossip and information vacuum challenges through highly transparent communication practices. The company holds monthly all-employee meetings where leadership shares detailed business performance, including challenges and uncertainties. Strategic dilemmas under consideration without predetermined answers. And explicit requests for employee input on difficult decisions. Employees submit questions anonymously through online platforms. Leadership addresses every substantive inquiry publicly in subsequent meetings, even when answers acknowledge uncertainty or limitations. The company also maintains internal communication platforms where teams post project updates, challenges, and requests for input across functions. Reducing information hoarding. Employee survey data shows exceptionally high agreement with statements about leadership transparency and information adequacy, correlating with notably low voluntary turnover despite competitive recruiting pressure in the industry. Psychological safety development and constructive peer interaction norms. While structural communication improvements reduce gossip drivers, shifting peer interaction norms requires direct intervention. Research demonstrates that psychological safety, the shared belief that interpersonal risk-taking is safe within the team or organization, enables the learning behaviors, innovation, and error reporting that organizational effectiveness requires. Edmondson, 1999. Psychological safety depends fundamentally on trust and develops through leader behaviors that invite participation, acknowledge fallibility, and respond non-defensively to challenges. Effective approaches include explicit behavioral norm articulation and modeling, define and communicate organizational standards distinguishing productive information sharing, seeking clarity, collaborative problem solving, raising legitimate concerns through appropriate channels, from destructive gossip, unverified speculation, character attacks, behind-back criticism. Ensure leadership visibly demonstrates norms, direct conversation, skill building and practice, train employees in approaching colleagues directly with concerns, questions, or feedback before involving third parties. Provide conversation frameworks addressing structure, tone, and constructive framing. Create practice opportunities with coaching and feedback in safe environments. Leadership response patterns that reinforce psychological safety. Coach executives and managers to visibly redirect gossip by asking, "Have you discussed this directly with person?" Or, "Let's bring person into this conversation." Demonstrate information seeking from primary sources. Model vulnerability through acknowledging own mistakes, uncertainties, and learning needs. Team rituals normalizing vulnerability and learning. Implement regular team practices that normalize interpersonal risk-taking, including structured check-ins where members share current challenges, periodic retrospectives reflecting on team mistakes and learnings, and help requests that demonstrate asking for support as strength. Gossip impact education connecting to values and performance. Share research on gossip's effects on trust, collaboration, innovation, and well-being. Explicitly connect to organizational values and performance priorities. Frame gossip as cultural threat undermining strategic goals rather than harmless entertainment. A large healthcare system addressed pervasive gossip and trust deficits by implementing comprehensive psychological safety and direct communication training across all staff levels. The organization introduced structured frameworks for difficult conversations and required all employees to attend workshops practicing direct feedback and constructive dialogue. Leadership visibly modeled the approach by publicly acknowledging mistakes, seeking input on challenges, and redirecting gossip to direct communication. The system also implemented team huddles where staff share daily challenges and mistakes in confidential settings. Normalizing vulnerability. Following implementation, employee engagement scores increased substantially. Safety reporting rose significantly as staff felt secure raising concerns. And staff turnover declined despite industry-wide retention pressures. Building long-term organizational trust. Resilience while addressing immediate trust deficits demands tactical intervention. Sustainable confidence requires strategic cultural architecture that embeds trustworthiness into organizational systems rather than depending on individual leader virtue or episodic initiatives. Psychological contract clarity and ongoing alignment. The foundation of employment trust rests on psychological contract alignment, congruence between employee expectations and organizational delivery. Russo, 1995. Research demonstrates that psychological contract violations, employee perceptions that the organization failed to fulfill promised obligations, predict decreased job satisfaction. Organizational commitment and performance, while increasing turnover intentions, Zhao et al. 2007. The 2025 trust crisis partly reflects widespread misalignment, where hiring processes, performance communications, and leadership behaviors created expectations subsequently violated through everyday organizational realities. Building long-term trust requires realistic organizational self-presentation during attraction, move beyond aspirational employer branding toward honest self-assessment and transparent communication about organizational strengths and acknowledged developmental areas. Research on realistic job previews, providing balanced information about positive and challenging work aspects during recruitment, demonstrates improved retention by enabling candidate self-selection and preventing expectation violations. Phillips, 1998. Organizations should communicate authentic culture, genuine development opportunities and limitations, realistic advancement timelines, and acknowledged workplace challenges rather than idealized portrayals. Explicit mutual expectation articulation at entry. Treat onboarding as opportunity to surface and align expectations beyond formal job descriptions. Facilitate structured discussions where new employees and managers explicitly discuss work preferences, communication styles, performance standards, development priorities, and support needs. Research demonstrates that socialization practices that reduce uncertainty and role ambiguity facilitate adjustment and commitment. Bauer et al. 2007. Creating shared understanding of mutual expectations reduces vulnerability to perceived violations stemming from misalignment rather than actual breach. Ongoing psychological contract maintenance and renegotiation. Psychological contracts require continuous tending as roles, priorities, circumstances, and individual needs evolve. Implement regular structured conversations, quarterly or semi-annual depending on change pace, where employees and managers reflect on whether the employment relationship delivers on mutual expectations and how arrangements might adjust as situations change. Proactive renegotiation prevents drift between assumed and actual agreements, reducing accumulation of minor violations that erode trust gradually. Transparent acknowledgement when organizational capacity changes, organizations facing resource constraints, strategic shifts or market pressures may need to reduce commitments previously made regarding development investments, advancement opportunities or work arrangements. Research demonstrates that psychological contract violation effects depend significantly on perceived breach explanation adequacy and violation intentionality. Robinson and Morrison. 2000. When organizations transparently acknowledge changed capacity, explain business rationale, and collaboratively explore alternatives, perceived violations and trust damage diminish compared to silent erosion or defensive denial. Distributed leadership and lateral accountability for trustworthiness. Organizations traditionally concentrate trust responsibility in HR functions or senior leadership. Yet the 2025 data reveals trust fractures at every organizational layer: manager relationships, peer dynamics, hiring experiences, and performance systems. Research demonstrates that trust operates at multiple organizational levels simultaneously, with different trust reference proving consequential for different outcomes. Fulmer and Gelfand. 2012. Sustainable trust requires distributing accountability across all organizational members rather than treating it as exclusive leadership domain. Building distributed accountability involves manager selection and promotion criteria expansion. Evaluate leadership candidates explicitly on trust-building capability alongside technical competence and results delivery. Incorporate assessment of trustworthiness dimensions: ability, management skill, competence, benevolence, employee welfare consideration, and integrity, word-deed consistency, into selection processes through behavioral interviews. Track record review, and feedback from potential direct reports when feasible. Research demonstrates that trust in supervisor predicts employee outcomes more strongly than trust in senior leadership. Dirks and Ferrin. 2002, making frontline leadership selection quality critical to organizational trust climate. Peer accountability for psychological safety and collaboration quality. Establish team-level responsibility for trust-affecting behaviors and psychological safety rather than positioning trust solely as leadership obligation. Implement periodic team retrospectives examining collaboration quality. Information sharing effectiveness, constructive conflict management, and collective improvement opportunities. Meta-analytic research demonstrates that team psychological safety predicts team learning behavior and performance. Fraser et al. 2017, with peer interactions contributing substantially to safety climate beyond leader behaviors alone. Trust metric transparency and improvement accountability. Link leader performance evaluations explicitly to trust indicators alongside financial and operational measures. Signaling organizational priority. Share aggregated trust assessment results with leaders and teams. Demonstrating willingness to surface challenges transparently. Research demonstrates that perceived organizational support, employees' beliefs about the extent to which the organization values contributions and cares about well-being, predicts organizational commitment and performance. Rhodes and Eisenberger. 2002, with transparent attention to trust functioning as meaningful support signal. Cross-functional trust-building capability development. Position trust capability as core organizational competency requiring systematic development rather than assumed soft skill. Provide training and practice opportunities in trustworthiness demonstrating behaviors including promise-keeping, transparent communication, procedural fairness, and vulnerability-based relationship building across all organizational levels. Not exclusively leadership populations. Systematic trust assessment and continuous improvement. The management principle that measured phenomena receive attention applies powerfully to trust. Yet many organizations treat confidence as intangible construct rather than trackable organizational vital sign. Long-term trust resilience requires systematic assessment, honest evaluation, and disciplined improvement efforts. Effective measurement approaches include multidimensional trust surveying across reference and components, move beyond general engagement items toward specific assessment of distinct trust reference, organization, senior leadership, direct manager, immediate team, peers broadly, HR systems, and trustworthiness dimensions, ability, benevolence, integrity, to enable targeted intervention. Implement regular pulse measurement, quarterly or more frequent, tracking trust trajectories rather than annual snapshots that miss deterioration timing and prevent timely response. Behavioral indicator monitoring complementing attitudinal surveys, supplements survey data with observable behavioral metrics reflecting trust levels including voluntary turnover patterns, particularly regretted loss and high performer attrition. Internal mobility rates, grievance and ethics hotline utilization. Anonymous feedback mechanism usage, and collaboration patterns observable in meeting behaviors or communication platform data. Trust manifests in action, making behavioral indicators valuable validation of and complement to self-reported attitudes. Qualitative trust barrier identification through listening, conduct regular focus groups. Confidential individual interviews, and exit conversations explicitly exploring trust dynamics. Recent experiences affecting confidence and perceived organizational trustworthiness strengths and gaps. Qualitative data provides contextual understanding of quantitative patterns and surfaces emerging issues before they appear in aggregated metrics. Trust data transparency demonstrating improvement commitment. Share aggregated trust assessment results openly with employees. Acknowledging areas requiring improvement rather than defensive filtering. Communicate specific actions being taken in response to identified issues. Timelines for implementation and metrics for tracking progress. Research demonstrates that responsiveness to employee voice, taking action based on employee input, predicts perceived organizational support and trust, Farndale et al. 2011. Public sharing of trust data and improvement commitments signals genuine accountability. Conclusion: the 2025 workplace trust crisis emerged not from catastrophic organizational failures but through accumulated credibility erosion across hiring transparency, performance fairness, leadership authenticity, and peer relationships. LiveCareer's comprehensive trust deficit report reveals a workforce that has shifted from default confidence to baseline skepticism, questioning whether job opportunities are genuine. Feedback is fair, managers are honest, and colleagues are trustworthy. This deterioration carries profound consequences extending far beyond employee morale. Meta-analytic research demonstrates that organizational trust predicts job performance, citizenship behaviors, innovation, satisfaction, commitment, and retention, while negatively relating to counterproductive behaviors, Colquitt et al. 2007. Individual employees bear costs through stress, career development limitations, and diminished well-being. The broader labor market suffers efficiency losses as deceptive practices and political dynamics obscure legitimate signals. Yet the 2025 evidence also illuminates restoration pathways grounded in organizational justice and psychological safety research. Organizations can rebuild credibility through transparent hiring communication that demonstrates informational justice, procedural fairness in performance systems that ensure consistent and unbiased evaluation, manager capability building that develops trustworthy leadership across ability, benevolence, integrity dimensions, structured communication infrastructure that prevents gossip-filled information vacuums, and psychological safety development that enables direct dialogue replacing destructive speculation. Sustainable trust, however, requires more than tactical responses to immediate deficits. Organizations must establish psychological contract clarity through realistic expectations and ongoing alignment. Distribute trust-building accountability beyond HR toward all organizational members, and systematically measure confidence while transparently addressing challenges. Measurement reveals